Thank you all very much for coming along tonight. Pleased to welcome you on behalf of Radical Independence Dundee and our sister group Radical Independence Glasgow. My name is Connor Beaton. I am the current secretary of Radical Independence Dundee. And if you don't know our group, what we're basically about is campaigning for Scottish independence on one hand, but also combining that with the fight for a radically different Scotland, one which genuinely tackles the great social and economic problems in our country. When we went into lockdown around this time last year, incredible how time has flown, we realised we couldn't carry on street campaigning in the way we wanted to. And so we started to host a series of Zoom discussions, much like this one. And so since last summer, we've invited guests like former SNP MP George Caravan to talk about the SNP. We've had former Green co-convener Maggie Chapman talking about NATO and Trident. We've had human rights lawyer Deborah Kiembe talking about her campaign against racist violence in Edinburgh. And I'm very actually pleased to say she's just been elected the rector of Edinburgh University. We had Miriam Brett, Katie Gallagher-Swan and Stuart Fairweather in November speaking about Freeports. And last month we had this brilliant Radical Burns night with guests from Dundee, London, New York and Dunedin. I'm really delighted that tonight we're joined by Peter Krykant, who has since last year run the UK's only overdose prevention site. He operates this life-saving facility from a former ambulance on the streets of Glasgow, and he does so simply because nobody else is. Peter is also now running as an independent candidate in the Scottish Parliament elections this May in his hometown of Falkirk. So what we're going to do is I'm going to invite Peter to introduce himself, talk a little bit about the service he provides and why, and maybe a little bit more about his important campaign. And then we're going to move to an open discussion. So people are welcome to ask questions, share their thoughts or experiences. We are recording this meeting, just to say it will appear on YouTube. So if anyone is uncomfortable being recorded, just say so and I'll edit you out. And our plan is that we will wrap up somewhere around 8:30 this evening. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring in Peter.
Right, well, thanks very much firstly for inviting me, Connor, and thanks everybody for allowing me to be part of this campaign and talk a little bit about what I've done in the last year, and also a little bit hopefully about my election campaign as well. So my name's Peter Krykant, and around about a year ago I said that I was going to start Scotland and the UK's first overdose prevention site. Just a little bit of background in terms of maybe if there's anybody on the call that doesn't understand what an overdose prevention site is. In some countries or in some environments, they're often referred to as drug consumption facilities or safe consumption sites or overdose prevention centres. So they provide a safe, sterile environment for people to come and inject drugs. The drugs that people are taking within these facilities are illegal drugs. They're drugs that they bring along with them. No drugs are provided in the facility. And places like Copenhagen, I actually went to Copenhagen at the start of last year, just before lockdown, to visit H17, which is the world's largest drug consumption facility. Within the drug consumption facility in Copenhagen, they actually have smoking facilities as well, so people can be encouraged to move from injecting drugs like heroin and cocaine or crack cocaine and onto actually smoking the drugs. In terms of our legal system, the current legal system that we're bound to by the UK government, we don't encourage that, and we don't provide a space for that in the Overdose Prevention Centre, because that's one of the legal barriers in terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. The Misuse of Drugs Act is so outdated that it doesn't cover specifically providing a space for drugs to be injected. It talks about preparing opium to be smoked, and it also mentions cannabis premises being provided for cannabis, and that's why cannabis clubs have always been closed down. So visiting Copenhagen was absolutely fantastic. I got to meet the people who set up the original facility in Copenhagen, and they called it civil disobedience. They done it in the back of a transit van, very much like I did to begin with. I went out and bought a transit minibus. I took the seats out the back, well, most of the seats out the back, and I went out and I drove into Glasgow city centre and did exactly what the guys in Copenhagen did. You know, they just did it anyway. So again, just to kind of enlarge upon that a little bit, the reason that I was just talking to Connor before we started this, one of the reasons the main reasons that I've went out and started this drug consumption facility is I was a public injecting drug user. You know, I was homeless for a long period of time, and I lived on the street, and the conditions that I was injecting drugs in, you know, like over 20 years ago, have not changed at all whatsoever for people. You know, an addiction at that point, it was hidden in alleyways, it was hidden under bridges and abandoned car parks. And you think, you know, with 77 cities around the world providing these sorts of safe spaces where not only can people be kept alive and bloodborne viruses can be stopped from being spread like hepatitis C and HIV, but they can also encourage people into treatment, into drug treatment services. When we look at the medically supervised injection facility in Sydney, over 80% of the people who regularly attend that facility actually go into treatment services. You know, they've got like oral health, they've got, you know, they've got doctors, social psychological support. You know, they've got all these add-on health and welfare facilities that people can engage with and actually get off illicit drugs. So what we find is where these facilities are based, not only do they stop discarded equipment because people aren't publicly injecting, but they also reduce hospital costs for NHS admissions because people don't get infected wounds. They reduce ambulance call-outs to the area. The police in places like Sydney and Copenhagen, the Copenhagen police have infamously being quoted as said it's the best thing that's ever happened. They no longer find dead bodies in the street. Other forces around the world where these facilities have been established for some time say that it greatly improves the amenity of the local area. Businesses and residents where these facilities are widely support them where they're established, again because of the benefits to society as a whole. And when you get people like Alison Hewlett and Tommy Shepherd and Ronnie Cowan and, you know, the MPs who have been going down to Westminster constantly asking, you know, the UK government and Priti Patel, you know, to make this possible through a change to the legislation of the Misuse of Drugs Act, and they consistently say really like unfounded stuff that has no basis and there's no evidence to support what they say. Things like, you know, that these are not in the best interests of society. I'd like to understand where they're getting that data from, where they're receiving that information from, because I can't find it in all the research that I've done around these sites. So yeah, so we went out and started it anyway, and we've been up and running now for a few months. We initially were out on a Friday, just providing the service one day a week. This was always about a political push for change. What we firmly believe, the people that have been helping me and supporting me on this journey for the last year, the legal experts and the drug policy experts and many just normal, ordinary, everyday people who have looked into this believe now that we do have a route to do this in Scotland without waiting for the UK government in Westminster to give us the green light to do so. And I suppose that's one of the things about being, you know, because I'm not a big, it's not that I'm not a big fan of like radical independence, but I'm not a big fan of the word radical when it comes to things like, you know, drug policy. It's like, this is not radical. You know, we're not asking for something radical to be done here. We're asking for something that's a health response to a health issue. You know, that's the simple reality of it. Anywhere where there's people publicly injecting, you know, and it's a real honour and a privilege to come on and talk to people from, you know, the Dundee movement, because, you know, I know that Dundee has one of the highest drug death rate now potentially in the world per head of population, even higher than Glasgow. You know, and where I'm focused on in Glasgow, somebody dies from a preventable drug death every 31 hours. You know, and I could go on about this for hours, you know, because ultimately it's not about people dying from drug deaths. Now, our drug deaths are a systematic failure of society to deal with the underlying conditions and issues that people are faced with in early childhood and growing up, the social poverty that people have experienced that leads them into those situations in the first place. So really, if we talk about solving drug deaths, for the longer term, what we've got to do, and this is what's led me on to my campaign to be elected for Falkirk East. Falkirk has seen the highest proportional increase in drug deaths in the last 10 years. In Scotland, we've went from having 5 deaths in 2009 to 41 deaths in 2019. And the ultimate solution to solving not just drug deaths, but also other things like Scotland's you know, the fact that Scotland has such a low life expectancy, you know, the fact that we have a continuous obesity problem, you know, the fact that we have, you know, people with such a high suicide rate, you know, these issues are all going to be dealt with investment in our local communities and investment in local organisations, grassroots movements, you know, community centres, further education, improving our education system and actually redesigning our education system. We know from the fiasco that just happened with, you know, the exam results that are 15.2% lower exam results were given to the schools from the most economically deprived areas. You know, that is not rocket science. We need to redesign our system, you know, and that's what's going to be able to be done, which is a bit radical, you know, because these things have been left, you know, our councils have been left to you know, continuously be underinvested in for generations now, you know, and that's why I have not joined a political party, and I don't run as a member of a political party, because I don't believe that independence or changes that need to happen prior or post independence are going to be done by the current political system that we have in Holyrood, because they don't get on with the day-to-day business. We need to invest right now in the future generations. Otherwise, we're not going to have a country to look after when we do get independence, because it's all going to, you know, and I was just about to use a word that's maybe not appropriate for if this is going to go on YouTube. But so yeah, I mean, that's kind of where we're at. We've been running for a few months. I've not added up the last couple of days, but we've supervised in the injection facility roughly about 140 injections so far. We've intervened in 2 overdoses where we've administered naloxone to people who, one person chose not to go in the ambulance when the ambulance arrived. The other person was breathing and did go in the ambulance, wasn't fully conscious, but was breathing and was breathing on their own by the time the ambulance arrived. Those people could have been dead if we were not there. The reality is that people are dying like that all the time. Just after we started, we found out that a 17-year-old girl died in the alleyway just round the corner from where we park. Obviously, you know, we weren't there at the time, and had that young lady been in the facility, she wouldn't be dead. That's a simple reality. Out of over 200 sites now for safer injecting facilities around the world, there's not been a single recorded fatality in any one of them. You know, and it's distressing. It's distressing when, for me personally, I get distressed because, especially when I was only out one day a week, you know, I would go out and then I would see the regulars come in. You know, there's a young 20-year-old girl who comes. She's got, on both arms, she's got the deepest self-harm scars that you could ever see. She started injecting heroin at the age of 15. She's in and out of homeless accommodation. She's injecting in her groin, and you know, she's just distressed. You know, she's just a distressed young individual who needs support, help, love, you know, and opportunities to live like that anymore, and people can change, because I was 20 years old myself, you know, and changes can happen that can completely redirect and reach and change people's lives, you know, because I was 20-year-old when I was out there and doing that same stuff, injecting in those horrible conditions. But we're just not presenting it, and we often, I'll finish because I'm sure other people want to talk and stuff, and but you know, I often hear this phrase, you know, about being hard to reach. Nobody's hard to reach, you know. That's not again, that's just like one of those things. It's like, you know, and I get, you know, people don't use language like that necessarily to you know, to it's just a phrase that's not great, because it's just that we've not got the ability to go out and reach these people, you know, as of yet, because we've just not put the, you know, the things in place that need to be in place, so that we can actually go out and, you know, engage with people that, you know, haven't engaged with services before. And you know, I met with Nicola Sturgeon and Angela Constance. I've met with Angela Constance a couple of times now, and you know, and in some ways I feel like I have, you know, there's been an element of betrayal, you know, and Graham, who's on the call, had probably seen a thread on Twitter about this a couple of days ago, you know, like, I'm an abstinence-based recovery, you know, and I fully support anybody and everybody's right to have that opportunity to go to residential rehab if that's what they want to do, you know, and those opportunities should always be there. But I know 100% without a shadow of a doubt, for me, that the way to get on top of Scotland's drug death crisis is to increase people into substitute prescribing. If we look at the examples of countries like Switzerland and Portugal, who have had these really high death rates, they've had similar to what Glasgow's got just now, with the UK's largest outbreak of HIV in 30 years, with over 190 cases. These countries have got on top of their drug death rates, brought the drug death rates down to a very minimal amount by getting people into substitute prescribing first and foremost, get people off illicit drugs. No country in the world is ever going to eradicate drug use. It's that simple. We're never ever going to get everybody off drugs. You know, and I feel like I've been disbarred a little bit from my old community, because, you know, I if you had asked me 18 months ago, I would have said that the best answer, the number one answer, was the Tory and now the Scottish Labour mantra that the best thing to do is get everybody off drugs, get everybody into residential rehabs. And that is a narrative that we've continued to feed in from 1971, from when President Nixon stood up and said we need an all-out offensive war on drugs, and Nancy Reagan said just say no, and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher said this is wrong, drugs are bad, we need to get everybody off them, and Priti Patel says the same thing now. You know, that break up the criminal gangs, stop the supplies, you know, like, and then you get the police posting a photo on Twitter where, you know, we've just busted £500,000 worth of benzodiazepines, and you get everybody clapping underneath the Twitter post, and the next day you go into Ayrshire where the bus was, and lo and behold, there's just as much benzodiazepines as there was the day before, street benzodiazepines. So, you know, I think that, yeah, we do need a range of options. We do need people to be able to get into residential rehabilitation centres, and people to be able to get the opportunities to get into abstinence-based recovery. But I think we also need to not kid ourselves that's not the big answer to immediately reducing our drug deaths. My number one thing that I emphasised with Nicola Sturgeon and Angela Constance was heroin-assisted treatment. If we expand heroin-assisted treatment like Switzerland done, and we roll that out throughout Scotland, that will get people into a point where they're safe and they're protected, and then the discussions can start to have about other psychological and social supports that need to be built up around that. And also that we need to use the police reporting. You know, police hold suspected drug death rates and they don't release them at this point. They released them for the first 2 calendar quarters of 2019, and then for one reason or another they stopped releasing them. They says that that wasn't the right thing to do. So we need to use that. We need to know where there's spikes in drug deaths so we can properly respond to those spikes when they're happening. But yeah, I mean, and that's kind of where we're at. I now run the service 4 days a week. We're out regularly. We're still not funded. We're still not recognised. We're still not illegal. If you ask for a statement from Police Scotland, we're still breaking a range of laws under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. And my response to that is exactly the same as it was when I first started. You know, that we're not breaking any laws under the 71 Act. The simple reality is it illegal to save people's lives? That would be my response to that. And if it is, I'm quite happy, and I've always said that I'm quite happy to be charged or arrested and go to court in order to try and challenge that law. Hopefully that will not happen, but we'll just get an official site, and it'll all be better for people. I'll finish by just saying today, you know, that a guy came into our van today, and I could see the tears in his eyes when he started talking to me. You know, he said his words were something around, you know, like, I just can't believe that you're doing this. You know, that we've got some like heat, because if I was in the alleyway, I'd be injecting in my groin. But because I'm in here and I've got the heat and the light, I can inject in my arm. Now, for anybody that doesn't know about injecting drug use, to inject heroin in your groin is really dangerous. It's like right next to your artery, your femoral artery. So to be injecting in your arm in comparison to injecting in your groin is so much less dangerous. And he said to me that this all started for him when his sister, who was 22, died, and he's never received any help, and he's never felt supported since then. You know, and that's kind of the stuff that, as I say, I don't care if I was to get arrested. I'll continue to do that because it's the right thing to do. So yeah, so if there is any like questions, or if anybody's got any comments or anything, I feel like I know that I've not been speaking for that long, like 20 minutes or so, but I feel like I've been going on for hours. So it's probably a good time to let others talk or ask questions or anything at all like that. Is that cool, Connor?
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. And it's funny, I asked Peter before we started whether he'd prepared anything, and he said no. But it really goes to show how well you know your stuff, that you can actually just speak off the cuff like that. What I'll do is, if anyone wants to put their hand up, you're more than welcome to come in and put your question or comment yourself. But if you'd prefer to use the chat box, you can leave questions or comments in there, and I will more than happily read them out. I've got one hand so far, so I'm going to bring in Yorgos.
I wasn't expecting to be in so quickly. Can you hear me okay?
No worries. In that case, I'll bring in Ian.
I can come on if you like.
No, I'll bring in Ian then.
Okay, that's fine. First of all, I'd just like to say, like, hats off to what you're doing. It's absolutely brilliant, and you know, also putting yourself on the line to do the right thing, and full respect for that. I was reading that the police tried to give you a caution or something like that, and you wouldn't accept that. So I'm just interested to see how that's going. But also, I'm wondering, what can we do to help you and kind of back you up, sort of thing. I mean, my suggestion would be, you know, some sort of campaign to get public pressure on the Scottish Government and Westminster, and that could involve loads of different things. I'm just asking, really, do you think that's something that would be helpful? And if not, what else would be helpful? Cheers.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Ian. Yeah, I think like from a Westminster perspective, the Tommy Shepherd MP, he presented a 10-minute private members bill a couple of months ago. I think it had its second reading. I don't know where it's at, but I mean, anybody who knows UK politics will know that a private members bill never becomes law. It just doesn't. It's one of those things. I think there was 147 private members bills from 2017 to 2019, and one actually became law. So it just doesn't happen, unless it's supported by the UK government. And Alison Thewlis, Ronnie Cowan, the Scottish Common Affairs Select Committee, the UK government's own Health and Social Care Partnership, the UK government's own Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs Act. Like everybody's practically banging their head against a brick wall with the UK government to say, like, we need change, we need reform. There is an interesting campaign that's going just now, though, Ian. It's called, the hashtag is 50 Years of Failure. And that campaign's been it's sort of like a joint campaign. It's being supported with Transform Drug Policy Foundation, Release Drugs, Anyone's Child, Leap UK, Leap Scotland, LEAP's Law Enforcement Action Partnership. They've got branches all over the world now. Law officers, many retired law officers and ex undercover coppers, etc. All coming together to try and push for change, for I think to reform our current laws, and what we're doing around drugs specifically. So all those things are worth following online and tweeting and retweeting. Write to your MP, write to your MSPs. In terms of the actual charge itself, I was charged. The Daily Record ran a story in the front page saying drugs van man arrested or something like that. They had to put a retractment statement because I wasn't actually arrested. I was just charged. Now this is the funny bit for me about the differences between Scottish law and UK law. I mean, if you're arrested down and charged down in England, you're going to get arrested and taken to the station. Here you can get charged and just left to go about your business, and that's what happened. I was charged under an alleged offence, which was Section 23A of the Misuse of Drugs Act, obstruction. Basically, there was 3 homeless people in my van. Obviously, the police knew what they were in there for. The police had stood and watched many other people going in the van and not tried to intervene in any way. But on this one occasion, there was an intervention, and there was an alleged obstruction. The alleged act that I obstructed them. After the homeless people came out the van, they were lined up against the wall and they were searched. And again, that threw back many memories for me. I remember being arrested in Birmingham simply for how I looked. I was about 20 years old at the time. I've still got the scars on my wrists from the handcuffs, these lock handcuffs that if you struggle, they just get tighter, sort of thing. So it just threw back memories for me. That these people were clearly homeless. They were like carrying their rucksacks and their sleeping bags, and they were to be lined up against the wall like that and searched. I just thought, this is absolutely terrible. We're not moving forward with this at all in any way, shape or form. So the Crown and Prosecutor Fiscal Service sent me a letter saying, if you accept a warning, we won't take this any further and we won't prosecute it. So my solicitor sent him a letter back saying, no, he's not accepting a warning. And then a few weeks later, I get another letter saying, okay, despite the fact that you're not accepting a warning, we're still not going to pursue it. And I think that goes to show how much public opinion in Scotland has changed, because it was the public opinion and the public pressure that really highlighted that Police Scotland shouldn't be intervening in this. They shouldn't be doing anything in terms of trying to stop this service, because it's clearly reducing the harm caused by drug use, and it's also benefiting society. And I think I'll just link this into a question that I've seen on there, and if there's anything more to it in the chat box. There was a question about how people in the local area or the businesses and the residents. I don't think I really covered that in my talk, but that's been one of the highlights of running this service, that we've proven that this service would be well received in the local area. Local residents have continuously engaged with us. We've had people coming out to donate money to us who live locally in the area. We've had really positive engagement from local businesses right where we park the facility, who have been emailing their MSPs and writing letters to their MSPs. We've had people coming out and challenging the police, you know, like a local resident. But what are you doing? What are you doing talking to him? Like, leave him alone. He's doing a great service here. What you need to do is, and you know, maybe people don't fully understand it. What you need to do is shut the needle exchange. Now, the worst thing that we could do is shut the needle exchange, because, you know, we've already got the UK's worst HIV outbreak in 30 years, but you can understand people's frustration when they stay right next to the busiest injecting equipment provision provider in Glasgow, and people are going in there, getting their equipment and going straight into their alleyways and using. Where if they're in our service, they're coming in, they're getting equipment, they're using in our service, and they're disposing of their equipment safely. You know, so that's been one of the most engaging parts, because nobody knew. The first time I drove my little white 17-seat minibus out there before I got the upgraded ambulance, I'm sitting thinking to myself, are the residents and the businesses all going to come out with pitchforks and chase me away? You know, like, you know, you hear these things and you still see some of it online. You know, I don't want your junkie bus in my street. You know, I think those comments generally come from people who have never. Who don't live in a street that has the current problems that Parney Street in Glasgow has. You know, they come from people who maybe don't have the problems on their front doorstep, because if they did have the problems on their front doorstep, they would maybe look at the evidence and say, actually, if we had one of these facilities here, it would really help us.
Thanks, Peter. And just to say, I will be reading out all the questions and comments from the chat. I see James has just said there, for example, the amount of times in my old job we had people injecting in the toilets or on the back stairs. Something like this can only be of benefit to businesses and prevent workers being put at risk. There's a question that's come in. So Chris, for example, says, the work you're doing is extremely valuable in a heavily conservative society, Peter. My dad was a drugs advice counsellor for about 20 years, and the social reality in Edinburgh at the time was much the same. I guess my biggest question is, how do you think the conservative war on drugs can be countered in light of the type of government we now have? It's very apt you mentioned Priti Patel in particular, given how draconian almost all of her takes are. And I think someone else also asked, yes, how do we, Graham asks, how do we counter the media and Westminster political narrative that the answer is a continued war on drugs?
Yeah, I think Scotland really, you know, has to push the constitutional boundaries with this, you know, in terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act. We all know that that power is held within the UK government, but policing and crime is fully devolved and health is fully devolved. Joe Fitzpatrick, the MSP for Dundee, you know, I think he was left in a really difficult situation. You know, he came into office mid-June 2018. Scotland at that point was already 3 years into the HIV outbreak. It was already halfway through the worst year on record of 2018. You know, the SNP had cut the drug and alcohol partnership budgets in 2016, so we were still in the middle of 2018 having the knock-on impact and effect of those budget cuts. But the reality is that he has a background in forestry, and I think that's one of the problems, you know, that we should be appointing public health ministers who have a background in some sort of health, you know, or an understanding of it. But in terms of what Joe Fitzpatrick did, and I think he got bad advice from, you know, he's obviously got a team of civil servants around him advising him what to say and things that he should present to the media and when he goes on TV, is bad advice, because he constantly deflected from the terrible drug death rates that we have in Scotland, and it's always about the UK government and we need the devolved powers, when the reality is that anybody with any common sense can see, despite having the same legislation as the UK government right now, we've got more than 3 times higher drug death rates. So there's something drastically going wrong with the system that we have in place. So I think for the first time, I'm hopeful that the SNP are going to do that, but I think it will be lost a little bit now in terms of the election, and that's the simple reality of it. It's all fair and well to stand up and say, like, here's an extra £250 million, an extra £50 million a year to deal with this. But we all know that we're now in the lead up to the Scottish parliamentary elections. So how do we do it? We continue to campaign in Scotland for change. We continue to highlight on our social media platforms. We continue to talk to our friends and family about the realities of drug addiction. And that people do, most people do come from these traumatic experiences and traumatic backgrounds. We can just keep driving forward as a society. I think there's real desire for this to be treated as a health issue, and if we have the desire, we can do things differently. I mean, what I would do if I was Nicola Sturgeon right now is I would phone up the Lord Advocate James Wolfe and I would say, "Excuse me, Mr. Wolfe, but can you just stand down, please? Can you just step aside? Because you're not doing, like, while you sit in your, Crown and Prosecutor Fiscal's fancy office, resting on your laurels, over 3 people a day are continuing to die, and what we do have is we've got the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner and Police and Crime Commissioners in England and Wales who are fully supportive of things, and it's going to end up that things are going to change in England and Wales before things change in Scotland, because it takes simple non-prosecutions, de facto decriminalisation stances, and to allow these like diversion schemes to come into place. What the police in Glasgow could be doing when they see somebody publicly injecting is they could be saying, "Excuse me, but can you maybe not do that there? There's a safer injecting facility just round the corner. Can you go round there and inject your drugs in there? Rather than being arrested or criminalised for it."
Thanks, Peter. I'm taking the questions a little bit out of order. Emily says, "Hi Peter, thank you so much for doing this. This is really brilliant. I see we've got quite a few councillors here today. What things can the councillors here do to immediately support you in your work?" There's a question here from Mercedes. Mercedes says, "Fantastic work you're doing, Peter. However, I really wish there were a few maverick mental health workers who could set up a service like yours and take to the street to work preventatively with the complex traumas presenting in the young people of Scotland now. It's heartbreaking to see so much unresolved traumas in our young adults, especially those in the street." Sorry, that's from Janet. Mercedes has got a question. "Are you planning on launching a pledge on this issue for sitting and prospective parliamentarians and councillors to sign up? It could be a good way to get commitment from candidates ahead of the next Parliament." And just to keep up that elected representative theme, I do see that Councillor Ken Lynn has his hand up, so I'll bring him in to put his question.
Yeah, if you can work out how to I'm unmuted now, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter, that was really enjoyed listening to you. I think in a lot of ways, what you're doing and what others want to do is pushing against an open door in Scotland. I went down to a meeting of the Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership, I think 3 years ago. And, that was just to effectively rubber stamp their decision. Yeah, we're going ahead with this. They had a building identified and everything. It was going to be great, all singing, all dancing. It wasn't going to be operated out of the back of a van, although you're doing great work with what little resources you have. I also think that in the last few years, the narrative has changed very much in the media. The Daily Record, the Courier is the main newspaper in Dundee, historically very conservative newspaper, with a small c and a large c for that matter, have changed in the last 3 years from because I'm on the Dundee Drugs Commission, and one of the, clearly, I better just check what you call it, overdose prevention site. We were calling it safe injecting site. That was mooted in the early days of the Drugs Commission. Of course, DC Thompson got a hold of that, and the headlines were shooting galleries for Dundee. Yeah. And 3 years later, it's much more nuanced approach, and they've actually gone from taking that line, shock horror, this is terrible, there'll be Armageddon, to having, quite a few times the leader comment in the newspaper, which is the newspaper's opinion, saying, yeah, we need to be bold. This is something that we need to try in Scotland, talking about safe injecting, or I need to check again, I'll need to remember this is a new term, overdose prevention. Trying to remember what my question was, and I'm just so impressed with what you're doing, because it's a brave thing to do. Nobody likes the thought of getting arrested and maybe thrown into the barrel for a while. I think it's fantastic. I'm just wondering, I mentioned Glasgow, and you've talked about parliamentarians. What kind of support have you? I mean, it doesn't sound like you had a great deal of support from Joe Fitzpatrick, but do you feel that you've been supported by politicians locally and nationally?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ken. And I think you're right. I mean, we are in some ways pushing against an open door when it comes to the health and social care partnerships. The drug and alcohol services, the alcohol and drug partnerships. Locally, certainly in Glasgow, are all very supportive. And like you say, they had a site identified, ready to go. The funding was all earmarked to get that site up and running. Unfortunately, the challenge has always been that legal area, the grey area, and what we previously thought, and I think what many people previously saw, is it just couldn't happen without a change to the Misuse of Drugs Act. And I think what we've proven is that it can. And I think if the police genuinely thought that there was something illegal going on with the actual running of the site, they would have intervened right at the beginning. They would have nipped it in the bud. And locally, yeah, we've had some great support. Alison Thewlis is the MP for the area, for the constituency area that we run the overdose prevention site in. She came out and visited the service. Paul Sweeney, the former Labour MP, who's running for election again for the Scottish Parliament elections in May. He's been a regular volunteer. He was great at the beginning to actually get the campaign off the ground. I didn't have a massive following, like social media following at the time, and he got like Helen Clark, who was the former Labour Prime Minister of New Zealand, involved. Now, she's not some former washed-up politician. She's chair of she's the current chair of the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, and she was appointed by the UN to evaluate the international response to coronavirus and the World Health Organization response. So when she got on board, that really took the campaign to the next level in terms of, publicly. Ronnie Cowan has also, I'm not sure if you know Ronnie Cowan, but he's also just been like a great supporter. He's the MP for Inverclyde, I believe. He's been a great supporter, came out to visit the service, and then he also donated quite a bit of money to get us going as well. Publicly donated it through our GoFundMe page. Now, quite interestingly, a few weeks back now, just before Christmas, I took the overdose prevention facility out to Holyrood. It was the old van before we got the upgraded ambulance, but I stood out. We parked it right outside Holyrood, and the message really was at that point, Joe Fitzpatrick, you're sitting in there just now. You're on $100,000 a year. Have the decency to come out and have a look at it. And again, this is probably just a bad advice that he's been getting, but he's been getting this advice about, he can't even engage, he can't talk about it. He can't I don't think he mentioned my name until like the day before he left, on BBC The Night, in terms of having some sort of live case. Now, there was never a live case. There was never a live case. There was a report sent to the prosecutor fiscal. That was never a live case. And I think in some ways he was thrown under the bus. for the want of a better word, considering it was a minibus that I was out in Holyrood with. But he was kind of thrown under the bus, you know, because right away, as soon as he left office, you know, there's an announcement that the First Minister was going to meet with me. There's an announcement that the Drug Policy Minister was going to meet with me. He was just getting bad advice. But this is really interesting. I'll finish on this before other questions. Now, we're sitting outside Holyrood with the overdose prevention bus, and the first person out was Miles Briggs, the Conservative MSP. Now, that for me was an interesting statement of intent, and I think that's probably been the biggest highlight. Well, there's, you know, I keep saying biggest highlights, but there's many highlights to get to where we are just now. To be out there running a full-time, more or less a full-time service is a highlight. They're all highlights, and I don't know if he was like a rabbit in the headlights and he was meant to say it, but I don't think he was. He looked a little bit like a rabbit in the headlights. He got asked on live TV on Scottish Politics Scotland, Maurice Golden, the MSP, the Conservatives MSP. The interviewer said to him, the Scottish Government are currently looking into overdose prevention sites. Do you support these? And his response was, we support anything that helps reduce Scotland's drug death crisis. I jumped on that straight away. That's a video that's going up on YouTube. Scottish Conservatives support overdose prevention sites. You know, we've got cross-party support. You know, that picks up 10,000 views right away when it gets retweeted by a couple of other MPs. And I think we are at that point now. You know, it's like you said, everybody supports us. I mean, the door is open, and it really is coming down to one person now. And I think everybody is of the same opinion. It's coming down to our senior law officer. And the frustrating part is that our senior law officer, in his evidence to the Scottish Common Affairs Select Committee, and also in any other statements that he's given, has reflected back on civil liabilities. Now, it's not his job. That is not his job. He shouldn't. What's he bothering about civil liabilities for? He's the senior law officer, criminal law, policing and crime. That's what he needs to deal with. If he takes care of the simple aspect of the simple possession of people attending the service, then the NHS can come in and take care of the civil liabilities aspect, or we can legislate through this Public Health Scotland Act 2008 to allow people to work in these facilities. And that is, and I'll just add into another question, seeing as how I'm on a roll here, Conor. Somebody else said something about legislation in there, and that's actually something that I'm looking to do. I'm looking to actually create a bill which I can make part of my campaign for election for the Falkirk East, you know, that I can hopefully get some other prospective MSPs to sign up to, that they would support this bill post-election, so that we can take this bill straight into the Parliament, and after May the 6th, and we can debate this bill, and we can make it, and we can get it through as an act of law in Scotland.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to bring in Alan Boylan, who's got a question, but just to run through, because I know there's a lot of hands up, just to let folk know that after Alan, I'm going to bring in Yorgos, then Bryce, then Willie, then Jack, and then Lynn. So on you go, Alan.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Peter, what you're doing is brilliant. It's a pity we didn't get the same and similar common sense comments about drug use to some of the workers. One of my biggest frustrations in the hostel was, and my colleagues, was we used to get them down to Ad Action or DPC, and they get stuck on the script. And then 5 or 6 years later, they come back in the hostel and they be on the same amount as what they were on when they were initially put on it. So there's big problems there with that. But the sad thing is, and people that get forgotten in this whole thing is the families. There's some help out there, but the saddest thing is when you see family members coming up, you know, and it breaks your heart. So my argument now is, are you prepared to take your arguments into scale? When America had the crack epidemic, they went in the kindergarten and started just say no message. Now, work with the kindergarten, the young kids, work with them. Didn't work with the ends in sort of like secondary school. But I really think you've got to stop the next generation through education. And that's that's a hard step. I can see the Tories up in arms about that. But Peter, keep speaking about it as a health issue. And other rest of the stuff that people throw against you is just bullshit to hide the inadequacies in the system, their prejudice, and my scheme. I don't want young kids getting onto the kit. You know, I would say that would be my priority, like stop new users through education. But well done, Peter. Hats off to you, mate.
Thanks, Alan.
I'll just quickly add that Mandy, also in the chat, says, thanks for your talk, Peter. Really interesting and innovative work in Scotland. Do you think that prevention has a key role? How do you reduce the numbers that start drug taking in the first place?
Yeah, I think, you know, I appreciate what Alan had to say there, but I think there's not much evidence out there at all to say that drug education actually will have any sort of impact. You know, obviously we know that, you know, like Alan said, the just say no message of, you know, Grange Hill. Don't know if anybody's of an era that they remember Grange Hill and Zamo and dancing about just say no. You know, and obviously I'm a bit of a generation where I just barely remember sort of, you know, Nancy Reagan and the message of, you know, just say no. And obviously with the internet, it's easy to look back on these messages now, but so I think I briefly touched on it earlier, but how we actually prevent, you know, most of the harms and most of the drug harms in generations to come is by investing in our communities. It's not about educating our communities about drugs, it's about investing in our communities, you know, because it's the social and the economic deprivation that often creates trauma that then leads people to taking drugs and later on in life. You know, and also the World Health Organization, you know, it's a well respected fact now that 90% of people who take drugs do so without ever having any problems or issues with them. You know, so it's like that we're talking about a small percentage. So see, when we talk about decriminalisation and the Portugal model, I think we often forget that decriminalisation is great for a couple of things. As an example, if you've got a mother of children who may not want to come forward because drugs are still criminalised, if they come forward and say they've got a drug problem, their children could be removed from their care, so that stops them coming forward. And decriminalisation helps, you know, somebody who likes to smoke a little bit of weed now and again, you know, somebody who maybe wants to grow a couple of cannabis plants, you know, they're not going to go to prison. There was a story in the Falkirk Herald the other day where I'm from. A guy went to prison for 23 months for some cannabis plants, you know, and it's like, absolutely blows my mind that we're just going to spend £36,500 a year to keep him in prison now, you know, and he's in there for nearly 2 years for a few cannabis plants. So decriminalisation stops people, maybe somebody who wants to get a little bit of cocaine and have a line of cocaine, you know, gets a gram of cocaine, has a line of cocaine in a nightclub, and then a month later they open that same little wrap up and they have another line of cocaine. You know, it's like that. Most people don't have drug problems when they use drugs. So it's what Portugal done is they took the money that they saved from all the criminalisation from sending people to prison, and they actually put that money in to support people, the 10% of people who do use drugs problematically, into drug treatment services, essentially get them off the really dangerous illicit drugs and onto pharmaceutical drugs, you know, pharmaceutical heroin, methadone. We can often stigmatize that. You know, one of my best friends who's now volunteering with me, my best friend's growing up, I lost contact with him for a while, but he was my best friend growing up, and he's out volunteering on the van with me now. He saved my life 20 odd years ago. You know, I overdosed in his flat in his house, called an ambulance, the ambulance arrived, they administered naloxone, my life was saved. He's been on methadone for years. He quite happily lives his life on methadone. You know, he doesn't use street drugs. You know, he smokes a little bit of weed. You know, he could still go to prison probably for that, but, you know, he smokes a bit of weed, gets his methadone on a weekly basis. he gets it in separate little bottles, so he's got it for the week. Doesn't have to sit and stand at a queue and be supervised drinking it and all that carry on. But he's really happy and contented, you know. And we have this sort of like stigmatization of substitute prescribing that you know, I was part of that stigmatization just a couple of years ago before I started to actually gather the evidence and look at what works. So hopefully that answered that question.
Great. I'm going to bring Bryce next. If you want to come in, Bryce.
Hi there. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I've got Asperger's syndrome before autism, just to let you know. So I've got lived experience with this myself, because actually drugs had ripped my mum, well, my relationship between my mum and my dad up, and basically it ripped my life apart with my dad. And I can totally understand. And the thing is this, so is that even though my dad, I believe he's still alive, he's still a death to me. So the thing is this, so is that I still feel quite upset about that. I've lost a father due to that. And I know what you were saying about education and all that, and I know that what you're talking about, education is like isn't the best thing, but I just would like to maybe raise something which I've noticed, because I'm noticed as somebody who's in politics, is that when I went to school, the fear of God was put into me about drugs. The fear of God into me, and it was all delivered by police, and the harms of it all. It was just scary. It was like, and I got the fear of God put into me, and that was, and then later on in life, I had the privilege of meeting Professor Dr. David Nutt, who is the guy who actually wrote the Lancet about the drug harms about all the different drugs and the multi-criteria decision analysis. And when that was released, it was talking about the different harms. And one of the things which I then found out, I was misinformed by education, by the educational professionals, by teachers, by social workers, by youth workers. I was all misinformed. I was lied to about these harms. They were all manufactured by ideology and the American drugs industry and big pharma. That's how I was taught. And to me, I think truth needs to be put back into education in Scotland, and I think the truth about the harms of drugs, so that the reason why I would like that to happen is that we need to get, for example, LEAP, because I know that there's LEAP people that LEAP I very much support them, but there's people like Professor Dr. David Nutt and others who should come involved in this discussion, because once people have got the seed inside their brain about, and young people knowing that this is actually the truth, that's the honest truth about the drugs, it will then lead to the young people seeing through the big pharma, seeing through the big Tory donations from big pharma, trying to protect their interests and all that. And they'll see the ideological argument of legalisation, decriminalisation, and bringing it into health arena. So I think education is important, because for me, if I was born with knowing that these drugs were not really as harmful as what I was actually led to believe, and they do provide beneficial, for example, medical cannabis and all that for people with autism like myself, I would have felt so much better. And I just think it's a great job that you're doing what you're doing, mate, because and I think also that I think it's also an equality issue, because people with autism, we think literally, we think in a different way. We're neurodiverse or neurodivergent, and for me, I think that there needs to be onus on education professionals and people that we owe to have the truth told to us about these things, the truth. And if we don't get the truth given to us, where are we going to go next? So I think it's also a discrimination issue. We're discriminating against people with autism by not telling the truth. So I'm sorry if this was me talking more and all that, but I just want to say you're doing a great job, and I hope people, these politicians that are councillors that are on here, please, please, I beg you, as somebody who's lost a father to drugs, who's lost my life really to drugs because of this, and all this type of trauma I've had to experience, please, I beg you, please, please, I beg you, do not be swayed by your donors or swayed by these things. Listen to the science, and don't be in. If the politician, if your political party whips you to say you vote this way, you vote that way, don't listen to them. Don't listen to them, because the thing is this: do what's inside your heart, because because your policies affect people like me and affect people who are on this tonight. So I beg you, please do the right thing in your own conscience, because it worries me sick of what's going to happen next to the next person and the next person. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryce. I
Very
think,
much, Bryce.
can I come back in on that quickly, Connor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Bryce, can I just say, I posted a little link there, and it's a podcast that I did with Professor David Nutt. I've great respect for him, and he's absolutely at the forefront of drug policy reform, and I would definitely recommend looking him up and looking at the work that he's done over the years. And I think you actually hit the nail on the head there. I was maybe a little bit dismissive about that there's not a lot of need for education, or there's not a lot of data to show that education for children will make a difference. But I think you're right, we need to educate that actually drugs are not as harmful as what they've made out to be, that 90% of the people who use drugs don't have all these issues and problems with them. And that's how we'll guide our society towards a more legalization, or at least decriminalization, and a more regulated market, so that the drugs that people are getting are regulated and they're not cut and they're not really harmful. And I've not read this yet, but it's definitely on my reading list. It's just came out, Dr. Carol Hart, about drug use for grown-ups is the title of his book, and that's on my new book, and it's on my reading list. Because I think what society needs to do is, if we move towards decriminalised drugs and more education about drugs not being as harmful as what they are, rather than saying to kids drugs are really bad, don't do them, we then get normal everyday members of society to step forward and say, actually, I've been using drugs for 20 years, and it's not, I've not ended up in a ditch, I've not had to, sit in a street begging. It's all, my life's been productive and good. So I think you're really, your contribution there was actually really kind of hit the nail on the head. And it just made me think about that book from Dr. Carol Hart, which I'm just going to order, about drug use for grown-ups.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer me. I really appreciate it. All I can just say, guys, is please, I'm begging you, begging every single politician that's on this call tonight, please go with your heart, because you are the power makers, you are the decision makers, you make the laws for this country, and you make the powers, and you can do this. You can do this. It's in your grasp. So thank you so much for raising this. I really cannot thank you enough for what you're doing, Peter, and I really do appreciate everything that you're doing. I really do, and it's going to hopefully prevent somebody who's going to lose a father about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryce. We've got about 15 minutes left, folk, before we try and finish up at 8:30. There are quite a few questions and contributions, so I'm going to try my best to make sure that we manage to hear all of them. I want to go back to one in the chat, Peter. Ben asks, how can we embolden more current and former users of drugs to share their lived experience in the way that you have to help tackle stigma and accelerate change? And I think there's a bit of a related question here, which is about communities that have problems associated with injecting drug use on its doorstep, where you often find ignorance, anger, and vitriol directed at addicts. Can we discuss how communities directly affected by the issues need to be at the forefront of winning this narrative? The evidence is there and needs to be disseminated properly, and an argument needs to take hold from it. They came in again and said, how best can we convince communities directly affected by the issues around drugs? I'm asking because where I grew up, there were still massive misconceptions about drug use, and addicts were treated shamefully by the public and the relevant authorities. So I think there's two questions there about users and former users themselves and about the communities they live in.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think sometimes the for people who have maybe previously been through problematic substance use and had a lot of different traumas and experiences that they've had previously. For a lot of people, it's a case of they don't want to be re-traumatized, to go back and talk about stuff. I'm fortunate in the fact that I've got a really supportive family unit. Like my wife's really supportive. I've got two beautiful young children. I've got lots of friends and family around me who fully support everything that I do. And I've got the ability to go and get counselling if I need that. Like a lot of people who have been through problematic substance use don't have that ability, or maybe don't have those strong units behind them. So it's like asking somebody to re-traumatize themselves is not always the best thing that we can do to support, longer term recovery from problematic substance use. But again, I think with the question about communities, I think it's more about, again, to sort of reflect on, I've not read this book yet, but I've read quotes from it, and there's been quite a lot in the press about it recently, in the Guardian and stuff. But Dr. Carol Hart, one of the things that, and I'm just taking bits that it's not like a direct quote, but he talks about, if all you ever hear about in terms of drug use, if you were going to buy a new car and all you ever heard about was that car being involved in a car crash, if that's all you ever heard, it's like you wouldn't buy that car. And it's kind of like the same with drug use. I mean, all we ever hear about drug use and all we've ever heard about drug use, and this links right back to the 70s now. And even longer, if you read Johann Hari's book Chasing the Scream, that kind of dates the war on drugs back to 100 years ago, when prohibition and alcohol stopped. And they had this big department all set up in the United States to deal with alcohol and try and stop alcohol, moonshine and that being carted around. And when they stopped doing that, they had nothing to do, so they turned their attention to drugs, and then the war on drugs actually became a war on people, because it was directed primarily at the black communities, and that's kind of how it continued for many generations. And even now in the UK, you're 3 times more likely, or 3 or 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black in the United Kingdom. So, I think we need to change the narrative, in terms of how we talk about drugs, and realise that, people who are going through those issues. I think somebody else mentioned it earlier. You're talking about people who, a lot of times it can, there's a lot of ex-armed forces who have alcohol or drug issues. You've got people who primarily come from very economically deprived areas, and again, I think, just to reflect on it again, that's how we really deal with these all society's issues, I believe, for the longer term, is to have a more socially economic function in society, where it's spread out throughout society, rather than 10% of the people having everything. And the rest all just left to kind of get on with it. So yeah, I think that's it. Just let's keep talking about it.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to bring in Willie.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Peter, you've been brilliant. And the good thing about it is that you have touched on the solution, and the solution is at the base. It's in the grassroots. And really that's where I would like to talk to, through you, to people on the Zoom, that we need to be doing things bottom up, and that there has been campaigns. I mean, you'll be aware of, I live in North Edinburgh, and we've always had drug issues, and HIV was the killer before they got the cocktail of drugs, but also the way in which people were responded. There was huge meetings in my area. There was 200-300 people came, and we said that we had to do something. And through Dr. Roy Robertson and my then wife, Heather Black, and the shadow organisation that we created, we got movement. We challenged, money was there. Civil servants, you're right, just didn't have a clue. I remember one meeting where they asked Heather, how much does it take to feed an addict's habit per day? And she said, well, probably at that time, about £100. It says, what job pays £100? As if they completely missed the fact that shoplifting, break-ins, all the other criminal activity to feed that habit was shooting everything up. People were going into prisons at £36,000, as you say. The answer lies in decriminalisation. It lies in communities fighting back to resolve the fundamental issue of poverty, inequality. And that's why the Radical Independence campaign that challenges it at the local level should be the model that we take. But we also should be, like Spartacus, there should be 1,000 Peters. Everybody should be saying, I'm Peter. And that's one of the defences of you, but it's also about building locally in Dundee, North Edinburgh and other places. We definitely need to have a campaign that says, we stand with you, we're here, we're standing with you, we're doing the same things, and challenge them to arrest us. Just like XR over the climate, we need to be doing that over drugs, drug deaths, and also other problems. The methadone problem, we got methadone, we got needle exchanges, we were at the forefront. Now the problem is it's been taken over by people who, for the want of a better word, make a living in the poverty industry, and we need to be challenging that. That they're not the enemy; they're just part of the problem. And I think that what we need to do is to do what you're doing in every community that's got this issue, and we'll see a fight back, and it'll raise the whole question of other things that are happening in society and how unequal it is, and why we need another Scotland in the future. And hopefully that'll come through independence. But yeah, sorry, Peter, I'm on a rant. So loved what you were doing, and we'll be there with you.
Thanks, Willie, and I couldn't agree more with the sentiment. Before I bring you back in, Peter, I'm just going to bring in another contributor, Maddie. On you go.
Hi, I'm sorry, my camera isn't working. I hope you can hear me okay. I just want to thank you again, similar to everybody else. I'm very inspired by the work you do. I had two sort of remarks. One was similar to Yorgos, is that I work for a charity, I work for shelter. And, you know, when it comes to ending homelessness, it's proven all across the world that you need a sort of more integrated approach to both drug use and homelessness and the interaction between those two. So I'd be very, very interested to have a conversation with you about how to sort of strengthen that bond between, to get people more help that they need it. And as you said, you know, you've got this space that for that provides a service for some people who are seen as hard to reach, and I just think that that's a great opportunity to be able to get involved with. And then my other question was actually much more practical in some ways, is how do you do it? How do you get the materials? How do you do this? And how would somebody who wants to do this in Edinburgh or in Dundee or anywhere start to do the same thing? Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, sorry, what was your name? Couldn't see
Maddie.
you. Maddie, hi, sorry, Maddie. Yeah, thanks, Maddie. So
no
yeah,
worries.
practically, in terms of the actual running of the service, you know, it was all just very like, just get out and do it. I mean, we put a little bit of money into get the first van myself. You know, it was bold, standard, basic. You know, I ripped all the seats out myself. You know, put the lino down, made it as sterile and as good a conditions as I could. The actual like injecting equipment, I used to go to the local like on the lead up to the taking it out for the first time, I just used to go to the local pharmacy and can I get 15 orange, 15 blues, and 15 1 mils and 20 waters and an naloxone kit. You know, they must have thought I was going up there every other day for like 45 needles and like waters and an naloxone kit. They must have thought I used a lot of drugs to be giving me all that equipment every couple of days. So, you know, it was just all like that. But now, you know, without naming any names, I've got some under the table agreements. You know, I got, you know, a box of equipment dropped off at my door the other day, and it's like just a big massive box with hundreds of waters and hundreds of injecting equipment, hundreds of naloxone kits, things like the defibrillators, you know, just bought them privately. So it's just all very much throw it together, you know. And if anybody was going to go out and do what I've done, what I would say is be mindful of the repercussions, because I lost my job through doing this. I worked for a third sector organisation as well. My last role was part-time, working 3 days a week in Glasgow city centre, out testing people who were at risk of HIV, publicly injecting homeless drug users. I said I was going to do this. The organisation said that there's a conflict of interest, and I said, but I work here part-time, I'm going to do it on my days off. But they still said there was a conflict of interest, so I had a choice: either walk away from my job or do what I was going to do. And by that time I was set to do it. So, but yeah, it would be great to have a conversation offline at any point about, you know, anything. So I'm happy to do that as well, Maddie.
Thanks, Peter. We're kind of running short on time, so I'm going to bring in a final contribution from Councillor Lynn Short.
Oh, thank you for bringing me in, Connor, and inviting us this evening. And thank you, Peter, for your inspiration, really. I agree with so many things that you've said. I'm pleased to hear that you've got a good brief. That's always really important to have that in your back pocket. Makes a big difference. I thought we'd met at the Overdose Awareness Day a couple of years ago at the steeple in Dundee, but I believe it might be one of your colleagues that was there that day. So I do apologise for not knowing who you were before coming into this. I was really interested in what you said about ACEs, because I think that's incredibly important, and we need to really get to this self-medicating sort of side of what we're looking at as an issue. I very much come to this now going into the Health and Social Care Partnership, but my previous experience is more around the sort of third sector. So I was involved in the Hope Festival, and that's a word that you used as well. And the Hope Festival was called that because it was to give hope, and it was hope for families as well, because it was done with the Family Sustainment Service, and that was across the city, everybody coming together to take away that stigma for families as well. And we do have the Recovery Roadmap here, which is now an app, which is a really good resource for people to go in and have a look at. The Safe Bus used to be something that that was a complement to our nighttime economy. But since COVID came along, a lot of things have changed, and the Safe Bus is now almost doing a kind of a holistic delivery, just falling short of what you're doing. And peer mentoring has become more and more common in the city. But my big question is, because Glasgow, Paisley, Inverclyde, Dundee, very working class, post-industrial cities with very similar situations. But in Dundee, and I may be well off the mark on this, but a lot of our problem is down to a cocktailing effect when it comes to the drug deaths. And how does your delivery cope with that sort of side of the issues? Because I mean, I've worked with THT as well, and been in Glasgow and heard about the BBVs and all that kind of thing. So, you know, there are different issues across the two cities.
Just before you come in, Peter, there's a slightly related question in the chat from Ali. Says, I noticed that distributing naloxone kits has been one response to drug deaths in Dundee and elsewhere. To me, that sounds like a good step, but doesn't seem nearly as effective as having a safe place to inject. What problems or benefits do you see from this?
Yeah, well, I think everything that you said there. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I do apologise. I'm doing Scots language lessons, so I'm calling myself Councillor so I can speak Scots. You can?
Councillor Shorty. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we you know, like, one response is not going to work across the country. You know, like, and Falkirk, there's no real, like, although Falkirk's had the biggest percentage increase in drug-related deaths in the last 10 years, a safer injecting facility in Falkirk's not going to work. You know, there's not a big public injecting community. You know, I think in Dundee there's a slightly higher issue with that. It's potentially something that could work in Dundee. I think there's a bit of public injecting goes on already. You know, you could also get people who live in Dundee to be using in a facility rather than using it home alone, which is a big problem. Naloxone is a key response. You know, the Scottish Ambulance Service are now distributing take-home naloxone to non-fatal overdoses. You know, these are all key responses. But I think ultimately the number one thing that's going to really reduce Scotland's drug death rates is what we see in other, exactly the same as what we see in other countries. It's about safe supply medication. You know, and again, I think ACEs are really important. You know, we know that a lot of people who suffer from, you know, addictions have these underlying traumatic experiences, but there is this perception, I think, out there that's for me, it's a false perception that people can only deal with underlying trauma and ACEs and issues that are going on if they're completely drug free. You know, and I don't think that needs to be the case. You know, people can function, and, you know, in like countries like Switzerland, where the number one thing that they did when they had these massive HIV outbreaks and hepatitis C outbreaks and people just dying left, right and centre, you know, is they took away the illegal heroin supply by implementing pharmaceutical grade diamorphine heroin. They gave people pharmaceutical heroin, you know, and that stopped people from dying. And what happens there is that you decrease the illegal supply chain, you save money, you can invest money into the communities so that, you know, the next generation coming up are not suffering from the same adverse childhood experiences that the last generation suffered from. So it's a range of responses, and different responses need targeted for different areas. And I'll finish because I know we're at the end, but that's one of the key things that I said in terms of getting the police reports for suspected drug deaths, because then we can look where there's spikes in deaths and we can go into those areas and respond. But the one of the biggest issues is these street benzodiazepines. If somebody's got a street benzodiazepine problem and they go to a service and say, I'm taking a handful of street benzodiazepines every day, can you give me a prescription so I stop that? They simply get told no. So that's the risk adverse nature of the NHS prescribing services. What's more risky, a handful of Valium that nobody knows what's in them, or a safe medical supply? At some point, somebody's got to make a decision on this. What is more risky?
I'm afraid we have to bring tonight to an end, and I'm very sorry to have to do it, because Peter, you've been brilliant, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us about your campaign, and we wish you the very best of luck with it going forward. Just to say, I will be putting in the chat a link to more information about Peter's campaign. You'll be able to see more, and I especially encourage people to donate to the running of that service. I'll also be including a link where you can sign up for updates about more radical independence events going forward. So if you agree with Willie, for example, about the need for grassroots organising, would love to have you involved. Peter, any final words you'd like to say?
No, thanks very much for having me, Connor. And like you said to everybody here, thanks very much for all the support so far. I'm just going to put my link tree in one more time. If anybody wants to follow the campaign, one of the best ways to continue to highlight this is to be out there on your social media platforms, retweeting, tweeting stuff, talking about drug deaths, talking about the solutions. If we all work together, and that's what the main focus is now, bring together the recovery communities, the harm reduction communities. Let's all work as a team to implement the solutions needed to stop this terrible accolade of worst drug death rates in the country, and also support Peter Krykant for Falkirk East as well, running against the big political party machines. Independence for independence.
Well said, Peter, and I wish you personally all the best of luck. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a good night.